A bitter and lonely millionaire named Edward hired a maid with a baby, and he never imagined it would change his life forever. Rain streamed down the enormous glass windows of Edward's mansion. The vastness of the room reflected the emptiness he felt in his chest. He was leaning against the door, looking at messages on his phone with an irritated expression. The last maid had resigned that morning, leaving the house even more silent and disorganized than he could bear. "Mr. Edward, the candidate has arrived," announced his secretary, entering the office with hurried steps. There wasn't time to select more options. "I think it's best to interview her quickly before your trip." Edward let out a heavy sigh, without taking his eyes off the phone screen. He wasn't interested in details, he just needed someone to keep the house running while he was away. "Send her in," he replied impatiently, tossing the phone onto the desk. Minutes later, a young woman entered the room carrying a baby in her arms. She wore simple clothes, but was immaculate. Her gaze showed strength and at the same time, a slight nervousness. Edward looked up at her, frowning as he noticed the child. "Who is that?" he asked, pointing to the baby with a nod of his head. "My daughter, sir," Beatriz replied, trying to stay calm. "Her name is Lia. I know it's unusual to bring a child to this type of work, but I needed this opportunity. I have no one to take care of her." Edward narrowed his eyes, measuring every word Beatriz said. To him, it was at least absurd. A maid with a baby seemed to be the perfect recipe for chaos. "This doesn't seem appropriate," he said with a cold voice. "This is a professional environment, not a place for distractions or extra problems." Beatriz took a deep breath. She knew this was her only chance. Her eyes shone with determination as she responded, "Sir, all I'm asking for is a chance. I am organized, dedicated, and can take care of the house as you need. My daughter won't be a problem, I guarantee it." Before Edward could respond, the secretary intervened, clearly worried about the urgency of the situation. "Mr. Edward, with all due respect, we don't have time to interview more candidates, and Mrs. Beatriz has good references." There was a moment of silence. Edward looked at the baby, who stared at him with big, curious eyes. Something about the simplicity of that scene made him uncomfortable, but he didn't want to delay his trip. "All right, you're hired," he finally said. "But this is temporary. Let's see how you do." Beatriz let out a relieved smile and thanked him sincerely. "Thank you, sir. I promise you won't regret it." Edward didn't respond, simply gesturing for her to leave, as if dismissing the conversation. He still didn't know it, but that seemingly simple decision would change his life forever. The first days at Edward's mansion were challenging for Beatriz. The house was immense, cold, and although well decorated, it seemed lifeless. Edward kept his rigid routine, leaving early for work and returning only at night, always with the same stern expression. To him, Beatriz was just an employee who should keep everything in order and preferably be invisible. One day, while Edward was having breakfast, Beatriz appeared to inform him that the pantry needed restocking. She carried Lia in her arms, who played distractedly with a plastic spoon. "Would you like me to get anything specific for the pantry?" she asked, trying to be practical and efficient. Edward looked up, but his expression remained impassive. He observed Lia for a moment before replying curtly, "Do as you see fit, but avoid excess." Beatriz nodded, but she noticed that Edward seemed bothered by the baby's presence in the room. Delicately, she withdrew, taking Lia to the room assigned to them. Over the days, small episodes marked their coexistence. Once, Lia dropped her plastic cup on the living room floor, while Edward was reading the newspaper. The noise, although insignificant, was enough for Edward to look up with impatience. "Can't you keep her away from the common areas?" he asked in a tone that sounded more like an order than a suggestion. Instead of responding defensively, Beatriz smiled gently. "I'm sorry, Mr. Edward. I'll take Lia to play in the room." Her patience and calmness stood in stark contrast to Edward's impatient temperament. Despite this, he began to notice something different in her demeanor. While he avoided unnecessary interactions, Beatriz made sure to greet the staff, organize the spaces in the house with care, and treat everyone with respect. That night, Edward arrived home earlier from work, exhausted after a grueling meeting. Upon entering the mansion, he heard soft music coming from the living room. Approaching, he saw Beatriz singing softly while rocking Lia in her arms. The scene was as simple as it was enchanting. For a brief moment he stood there just observing. When Beatriz noticed his presence, she immediately apologized. "Mr. Edward, I didn't know you were back." "It doesn't matter," Edward replied dryly, looking away. "Just don't make too much noise." Beatriz nodded, but something in Edward's tone seemed less rigid than usual. That night, while he was in his office, Edward reflected for a few moments. As much as he didn't want to admit it, there was something different in the air since Beatriz and Lia's arrival. The mansion no longer seemed so empty, and the absolute silence he once cherished now felt less comfortable. The baby, with her laughter and playfulness, seemed to bring a touch of life to the environment, and Beatriz, with her serenity and gentleness, was slowly disarming the coldness that Edward carried like armor. Days passed, and Edward began to notice subtle changes in the house. The environment, once marked by silence and coldness, was now filled with the sound of Lia's laughter and Beatriz's sweet voice singing or talking as she worked. Although he would never admit it, he found himself from time to time observing the new maid's routine with curiosity. One morning, while he was having his coffee, Edward heard light footsteps in the living room. When he looked, he saw Lia crawling towards him with a wide, clumsy smile. The girl stopped at the feet of his chair and, without warning, grabbed the hem of Edward's pants, trying to stand up. Edward froze. He didn't know how to deal with children, especially ones so small. He looked at the baby, then at Beatriz, who entered the room running. "Lia, sorry, Mr. Edward. She got away while I was tidying the kitchen," she said hurriedly, picking the girl up in her arms. "She didn't hurt me," Edward responded almost automatically, while straightening the hem of his pants. Beatriz smiled with relief. "She has this habit of exploring everything. She's curious by nature." Edward shrugged, but something about that interaction stayed on his mind for the rest of the day. The innocent smile of Lia, and the way Beatriz looked at her with affection made him remember something distant, almost forgotten, a time when he also believed in bonds and affections. Later, when he returned from work, Edward found the living room organized in a different way. There was a small basket of toys in the corner, and a colorful blanket covering the sofa, giving the environment a touch of coziness. He frowned, not knowing how to react. That night he called Beatriz. "Beatriz, I need to talk about something." She appeared immediately, holding Lia, who was almost asleep. "Yes, Mr. Edward? What are these changes in the living room?" he asked, pointing to the toy basket and the blanket. Beatriz seemed a bit embarrassed. "I'm sorry if this bothered you, sir. I thought a cozier touch could make the environment more pleasant, but I can undo everything if you prefer." Edward shook his head slowly. "There's no need. Just inform me before making these changes next time." "Sure, sir." As she left, Edward observed the baby nestled in her mother's arms, breathing quietly. Despite his resistance, he began to realize that the changes weren't so bad after all. The following weekend, Edward decided not to work and, by chance, ended up crossing paths with Beatriz in the kitchen. She was preparing lunch while Lia played in an improvised playpen. Edward remained silent for a few moments, watching her stir the pot carefully and hum softly. "Do you always sing?" he asked, breaking the silence. Beatriz turned, surprised by the question. "Oh yes. It's a habit I've had since I was little. I think it helps keep the mood light and happy," she replied, a hint of a smile on her lips. "It keeps the atmosphere light." Edward nodded, although he couldn't quite understand why it mattered. "I see," he said, feeling out of his depth. "Carry on then." Over the next few days, Edward found himself drawn more frequently to the areas of the house where Beatriz and Lia spent their time. He was increasingly fascinated by the way Beatriz handled her dual roles with grace and resilience. Even more, he was affected by the warmth and life that Lia brought to the cold, impersonal mansion. One evening, as he was about to retire to his study, he passed by the living room and heard Beatriz's gentle singing. Peering inside, he saw her rocking Lia, who was already fast asleep. The scene stirred something deep within him, something he hadn't felt in years. "Beatriz," he said, his voice unexpectedly soft. Startled, she looked up. "Yes, Mr. Edward?" "Thank you," he said, hesitating slightly. For everything. Beatrice's eyes widened in surprise, then softened with understanding. You're welcome, sir. As Edward walked away, he couldn't help but feel a shift within himself. The walls he'd built around his heart seemed a little less impenetrable, the loneliness a bit more bearable. For the first time in a long while, he felt a glimmer of hope. And so, what started as a desperate hiring of a maid with a baby became a journey of healing and transformation for Edward. The presence of Beatriz and Lia in his life gradually thawed the ice that had formed around his heart, teaching him that love, in all its forms, was worth the risk. That afternoon, while Edward was having his coffee, he heard light footsteps in the living room. When he looked up, he saw Lia crawling towards him with a wide, clumsy smile. The girl stopped at the foot of his chair, and without warning, grabbed the hem of Edward's pants, trying to stand up. Edward froze. He didn't know how to deal with children, especially one so small. He looked at the baby, then at Beatriz, who rushed into the room. Lia, I'm sorry, Mr. Edward. She got away while I was tidying the kitchen, she said hurriedly, picking up the girl in her arms. She didn't hurt me, Edward responded almost automatically, straightening the hem of his pants. Beatriz smiled with relief. She has this habit of exploring everything. She's curious by nature. Edward shrugged, but something about that interaction stayed on his mind for the rest of the day. The innocent smile of Lia, and the way Beatriz looked at her with affection reminded him of something distant, almost forgotten. A time when he also believed in bonds and affections. Later, when he returned from work, Edward found the living room organized differently. There was a small basket of toys in the corner, and a colorful blanket covered the sofa, giving the environment a touch of coziness. He frowned, unsure of how to react. That night he called Beatriz. Beatriz, I need to talk about something. She appeared immediately, holding Lia, who was almost asleep. Yes, Mr. Edward? What are these changes in the living room? He asked, pointing to the toy basket and the blanket. Beatriz seemed a bit embarrassed. I'm sorry if this bothered you, sir. I thought a cozier touch could make the environment more pleasant. But I can undo everything if you prefer. Edward shook his head slowly. No need. Just let me know before making these changes next time. Of course, sir. As she left, Edward observed the baby nestled in her mother's arms, breathing quietly. Despite his resistance, he began to realize that the changes weren't so bad after all. The following weekend, Edward decided not to work and by chance, ended up crossing paths with Beatriz in the kitchen. She was preparing lunch while Lia played in an improvised playpen. Edward remained silent for a few moments, watching her stir the pot carefully and hum softly. Do you always sing? He asked, breaking the silence. Beatriz turned, surprised by the question. Oh yes, it's a habit I've had since I was little. I think music makes everything lighter. Edward made a sound of agreement, but didn't comment further. However, her response echoed in his mind. Make everything lighter, something he had long forgotten how to do. Later that same day, while resting in the living room, Edward heard Beatriz talking to Lia in the bedroom. Did you know, my love, that Mr. Edward is a very intelligent man? That's why he's always so busy. He works very hard to be so important. Edward frowned. He had never imagined that someone could see him that way. Beatriz's words, though spoken to the baby, touched a forgotten part of his soul, questioning whether he truly wanted to live such an isolated life. For the first time, Eduardo began to realize that the presence of Beatriz and Lia was not just tolerable. It was in some way necessary. Eduardo always believed that keeping distance was the key to avoiding disappointments. But with Beatriz and Lia around, the barrier he had built over the years was starting to show cracks. He found himself spending more time at home, delaying meetings and postponing trips. Something in his routine had changed, but he still refused to admit it to himself. One sunny afternoon, Eduardo decided to take a break from work and went down to the living room. He found Beatriz kneeling on the floor, playing with Lia. She was helping the baby build colorful blocks, encouraging her with gentle words. Very good, Lia. You're getting smarter, she said, smiling. Eduardo stood in the doorway for a moment, watching the scene. Something so simple, yet it seemed to carry a joy he hadn't seen in years. Without realizing it, he smiled slightly, but quickly hid the expression when Beatriz noticed his presence. "Mr. Eduardo, do you need anything?" she asked, standing up immediately. He shook his head. "No, I just wanted to know. Has she always been so cheerful?" he asked, pointing to Lia, who was now holding one of the blocks in her mouth. Beatriz let out a light laugh. "Always. Even in difficult times, she has this energy that keeps me going. It's amazing how children see the world, isn't it?" Eduardo made a sound of agreement, and, surprising himself, sat down in a nearby armchair. "I don't know much about children. I've never been around any." Beatriz noticed the distant tone in his voice, but chose not to press him. "They teach us a lot, Mr. Eduardo. More than we imagine." The conversation was interrupted when Lia crawled over to Eduardo, holding one of the blocks and offering it to him, as if it were a gift. Eduardo hesitated, but eventually took the toy. "Thank you, Lia," he said with an almost imperceptible smile. Beatriz watched the scene with tenderness. It was the first time Eduardo seemed to allow himself to interact with Lia spontaneously. That night, while he was in his office, Eduardo opened a drawer where he kept some old photographs. There was one in particular that he hadn't seen in years. A picture of him with his ex-fiancée Laura, smiling during a trip to the beach. The memory hit him like a punch in the gut. Laura was the last person Eduardo had truly opened up to. They had plans to get married, but her betrayal destroyed everything. Since then, he had closed himself off to any kind of affection. "I don't need anyone," he repeated to himself like a mantra since that day. But remembering Lia's smile and Beatriz's gentleness, he began to question whether he really wanted to live such an isolated life. To question whether his loneliness was really the best choice. The next day, Edward called Beatriz to his office. She entered with a curious expression, holding Lia, who was playing with a stuffed animal. "I need to know something," he began directly. "Why did you come to work here? I mean, you seemed nervous when you arrived, but you've never complained about anything." Beatriz looked at Lia as if seeking courage. "I was desperate, Mr. Edward. When my husband abandoned us, I was left without a home and without money. This was the only opportunity one found to start over." There was an uncomfortable silence. Edward didn't expect such honesty. "I understand. Sometimes life forces us to make difficult choices," he said, almost as if he were speaking to himself. Beatriz nodded but smiled slightly. "Yes, but I also believe that good things can come from these difficult moments." Edward didn't respond, but he was thoughtful. For the first time in years, he felt he was in the presence of someone who understood past pains without judging him. Living with Beatriz and Lia was beginning to affect Edward in ways he never imagined. Small gestures, like the baby's laughter upon seeing him, or the hot coffee Beatriz prepared every morning without his asking, created an atmosphere of coziness in the house that he hadn't felt in years. One morning, Edward went down to have coffee and found Beatriz in the kitchen. Lia was in her improvised playpen, playing with her blocks, while Beatriz was mixing batter for pancakes. She hummed a gentle melody, and Edward noticed that even this seemed to bring life to the environment. "You seem cheerful today," he commented casually, as he sat at the table. Beatriz turned with a smile on her face. "It's hard not to be, Mr. Edward. Lia slept through the night, and today is a beautiful day." Edward raised an eyebrow. "You can find beauty even in simple things, can't you?" Beatriz shrugged. "I think life is complicated enough. If we don't see the little good things, we end up missing what really matters." Her words echoed in Edward's mind throughout breakfast. It was something so simple, yet it carried a truth he had ignored for years. That afternoon, Edward decided to do something he hadn't done in a long time: walk through his own garden. He always hired gardeners to care for the space, but never enjoyed its beauty. This time, he took a book with him and sat on one of the benches, under the shade of a tree. A short time later, Beatriz appeared with Lia in her arms. She seemed surprised to see him there. "I didn't know you liked to come to the garden, Mr. Edward," she said, setting Lia down on a small blanket on the grass. "Neither did I," he replied honestly. Beatriz laughed softly and sat down near the baby, who was trying to crawl toward the flowers. Edward closed his book and watched the scene for a few moments. "You seem very peaceful here," he commented. "It's my favorite place in the house." I always come here with Lia when she's restless. The fresh air seems to calm her. Edward was silent for a moment before asking a question he didn't expect himself to ask. Have you ever thought about giving up on everything? Beatriz looked at him, surprised by the question. Yes, I have, she admitted. But then I look at Lia. She depends on me. And that gives me the strength to continue. Sometimes love is what keeps us standing. Edward looked away, staring at the blue sky. He knew Beatriz was right, but acknowledging it was a difficult step. To check on her. When he opened the door, he saw Beatriz rocking the baby in her arms, trying to soothe her. Is there a problem? He asked in a low voice, so as not to startle the little girl. Beatriz looked at him with a tired smile. I think she's teething. It happens when their teeth start coming in. Edward frowned. Is there anything I can do? She seemed surprised by the offer, but shook her head. We just need to wait for her to calm down. But thank you for asking, Mr. Edward. He stayed at the door for a few more moments, watching Beatriz cradle Lia with infinite patience. That simple scene touched something in his heart. Before leaving, he said, If you need anything, let me know. Beatriz nodded, and Edward returned to his office, but he couldn't concentrate on the reports. Something was changing inside him, and he began to realize that maybe this change wasn't a bad thing. Days passed, and Edward felt increasingly comfortable with the presence of Beatriz and Lia. He had developed the habit of coming down for breakfast every day, something that was previously unthinkable for him. That morning, Beatriz was in the kitchen with Lia in her arms while making pancakes. Edward arrived and, before even sitting down, grabbed a cup of coffee and stood next to her, watching the baby. She seems more relaxed today, Edward commented, pointing to Lia, who was playing with Beatriz's hair. Yes, the teething pain has lessened. I think she likes being in the kitchen with me, Beatriz replied, smiling. Edward took one of the pancakes Beatriz had just placed on a plate and took a bite. It's really good. You have a talent for these things. Beatriz laughed. Thank you, but I think it's just practice. When you have a baby, you need to learn to manage. Edward was silent for a few moments, but then he asked a question that had been on his mind for a long time. Beatriz, have you ever thought about building a different life, something that isn't so hard? She paused for a moment and looked at him. I think about it every day, Mr. Edward. But life isn't something we can plan like a project. We don't always have control over what happens. Edward nodded, reflecting on her words. That's true. I used to think I had control over everything, but I guess I was wrong. That afternoon, while Edward was working in his office, he heard laughter coming from the garden. He went to the window and saw Beatriz and Lia sitting on the grass. She seemed to be telling the baby a story, who laughed while trying to reach for the nearby flowers. Edward couldn't help but smile. He closed his laptop and went down to the garden. Beatriz saw him approaching and made space for him to sit next to them. Did I interrupt something? He asked playfully. We were just chatting, Beatriz replied with a smile. Edward looked at Lia, who immediately tried to crawl toward him. It looks like she likes you, Beatriz said. Edward picked up the baby, feeling the softness and warmth of her little body. He was surprised by the sense of peace it brought him. Beatriz watched the scene with tenderness, noticing that Edward was slowly allowing himself to become part of this small, unlikely family. Though still a bit awkward, he was more comfortable than before. Lia pulled on one of Eduardo's jacket buttons, as if she were fascinated by it. She's persistent, Eduardo commented. She's curious. I think she sees the world as a big adventure, Beatriz said. Eduardo looked at the baby in his arms and felt a warmth in his chest. It was a feeling he hadn't had in years, maybe decades. You know, Beatriz, I never thought I could enjoy having company. I spent so much time alone that I got used to it. Beatriz watched attentively, but didn't interrupt. I think loneliness is something we learn to accept, but that doesn't mean it's good, he continued. Beatriz smiled, but there was a touch of melancholy. Loneliness can teach us many things, but love and companionship teach us much more. Her words stayed with Eduardo for the rest of the day. He began to realize that, for the first time in years, his house no longer felt empty. Later that night, Eduardo was sitting in the living room reviewing some papers when Beatriz appeared with Lia asleep in her arms. She finally slept, she said, smiling. Eduardo looked at the baby and, without thinking, asked, "Can I hold her for a moment?" Beatriz hesitated for a second, but carefully handed Lia to him. Eduardo held the baby with a delicateness he didn't know he had. "She looks so peaceful," Eduardo commented quietly. Beatriz nodded. "That's what children do. They remind us that despite everything, there are good things in the world." Eduardo looked at her and, for a moment, felt like opening up his heart. But instead, he just carefully handed Lia back and said, "Thank you for everything, Beatriz." She smiled, not entirely understanding what he meant, but she sensed those words carried something deeper. The sound of rain tapping against the house windows created a gentle melody that night. Eduardo sat in the living room, staring at the lit fireplace. He couldn't focus on the contracts and reports scattered on the table. Something inside him felt restless, as if he were facing a change he didn't know how to handle. Beatriz entered the room carrying a tray with tea and some slices of cake. "I brought this for you. I thought you could use a break," she said with the same calm smile as always. Eduardo looked up and, for a moment, was silent. The simplicity of the gesture touched him more than he expected. "Thank you, Beatriz. You really are different," he said, with a tone mixing admiration and curiosity. She sat in a nearby armchair, while Lia slept in the bedroom. "Different how?" she asked, laughing. "I don't know. I think you see the world in a way that's so opposite to mine. I always saw things as problems to be solved, while you find beauty even in difficulties." Beatriz looked at him with tenderness. "I think life is hard enough. If we don't try to see the good side, we end up being consumed by the weight of bad things." Eduardo was silent, reflecting on her words. He knew Beatriz had gone through difficulties, yet she managed to maintain genuine optimism. "And what about you, Mr. Eduardo? What made you this way?" she ventured, choosing her words carefully. He stared at the fireplace for a few seconds before responding. "I was different once, lighter perhaps. But life hasn't been kind to me. I've lost important people, and it made me cautious. I built these walls around myself because it was easier than dealing with the pain." Beatriz looked at him with understanding eyes but said nothing. Eduardo appreciated her silence, which felt more comforting than any word. In the following days, Eduardo began to step out of his usual routine. He spent more time in the garden, now in the company of Beatriz and Lia, and even set aside some commitments to dine with them. The house, once cold and lonely, was becoming a home. One night, Eduardo found Lia crawling down the hallway toward his office. He bent down and picked up the baby, who started laughing while pulling on his tie. "You're persistent, aren't you?" he joked as he walked back to Beatriz's room. When he arrived, he found Beatriz folding clothes in the room. "Look who decided to escape," Eduardo said, handing Lia to her. Beatriz laughed. "To be alone. I want you and Lia to be a significant part of my life." Beatriz was surprised by the declaration, but also moved. "Eduardo, this is a big step. Are you sure?" He nodded with a sincere smile. "Yes, I've never been so sure of anything in my life. I realized that loneliness is not the answer. You and Lia have brought light into my life, and I don't want to lose that." She looked at him, feeling the weight of his sincerity in his words. "I feel something special here too, Eduardo. But we need to take it slow. I want to make sure we're doing this for the right reasons." Eduardo agreed. "Of course, I understand. Let's take it one step at a time." As the days went by, Eduardo, Beatriz, and Lia began to build a new routine. Their conversations became more frequent and deeper, and the moments of shared joy multiplied. The house, once cold and lonely, was now filled with laughter, music, and the presence of a new family. Eduardo felt that he was rediscovering what it meant to live and love. He realized that he no longer needed the walls he had built around his heart. With Beatriz and Lia by his side, he was finally open to the possibility of happiness. One morning, while having breakfast together, Eduardo looked at Beatriz and said, "You know, I never imagined life could be like this. You two have changed everything for the better." Beatriz smiled and replied, "Sometimes, all we need is a chance to start over. And I'm glad you gave us that chance, Eduardo." Eduardo held Beatriz's hand tenderly and looked at Lia, who was playing happily on the floor. "I'm looking forward to seeing where this new journey will take us." And so the story of Eduardo, Beatriz, and Lia continued to unfold, full of new discoveries, love, and hope for the future. Feel free to use this translated text for your voice generation on Clipchamp. If you need any more translations or adjustments, just let me know. Live this way, without caring about the things that really matter. Eduardo moved closer, feeling the warmth of Beatriz's body just inches from his. The air between them was dense with the intensity of the moment. He realized how vulnerable she was, her hands trembling slightly and doubt in her eyes. For a moment, everything around them seemed to disappear, leaving only the sound of their ragged breaths. The truth he had just declared echoed in his mind, but he felt that words were not enough to convey what was in his heart. Then, without further hesitation, he gently touched her face, his thumb caressing her soft, warm skin. Her eyes closed for a moment before he moved his lips closer with a delicacy that seemed almost fearful, as if the gesture were as fragile as a sigh. The kiss happened softly, unhurried, as if both were testing cold water for the first time. It was a light touch, but full of unspoken intentions, a gesture that spoke more than any words could express. Beatriz surrendered to the moment, feeling her breath align with his, as if time had stretched and lost itself in the space between them. Eduardo's taste was unexpectedly sweet, and when he pulled away, her eyes opened slowly, seeking his. He saw something new in them, something he didn't expect, a silent acceptance but full of hope. She didn't need to say anything. What they both felt was now clear, and the future that opened before them already seemed more promising than either of them imagined. The emotion between them felt almost palpable. Beatriz looked at him, her heart beating faster. She knew that Eduardo was not just offering a new beginning for himself, but for both of them. And as much as she was cautious, a part of her heart believed he was being genuine. "Eduardo," she began with a soft voice but full of emotion, "I can't promise anything, but I believe that we all deserve a chance to be happy, even after so much suffering. If you're willing to try, so am I." Eduardo smiled, a genuine smile full of hope, something he hadn't felt in years. In the following days, Eduardo's house became even more full of life. Beatriz and Lia, who had already brought joy to the environment, were now a constant presence in his heart. One morning, while Beatriz was preparing breakfast, Eduardo entered the kitchen and found her smiling at Lia, who was eating her first baby food. He approached her without saying a word, just extending his hand. She looked at him and, without hesitation, placed her hand in his, feeling the mutual trust that was beginning to grow between them. "I'm happy we gave this a chance, Beatriz," he said with a soft and grateful voice. She smiled, looking into his eyes. "Me too. I think life has a way of surprising us when we least expect it." Eduardo watched the baby, now playing with toys on the floor. "And you, Lia, will have a life full of love. That's what matters most." Beatriz moved closer to him, placing her hand on Eduardo's shoulder. "This is our new beginning, Eduardo. And this is just the start of a beautiful journey." The house was now filled with a peace Eduardo never imagined possible. Time seemed to move differently. Every day with Beatriz and Lia made him feel as if he were rediscovering what truly mattered in life. He had distanced himself from many things over the years, building a wall around his heart, but now everything seemed simpler, clearer. Beatriz, with her silent kindness, and Lia, with her enchanting innocence, had brought the lightness he so needed. One afternoon Eduardo went to the office to review some papers, but his thoughts were far away. He lost himself in recent memories. Lia's laughter, afternoons in the garden, deep conversations with Beatriz. He never knew his life could have so much meaning. He had convinced himself that his happiness depended solely on success, but now he knew that true happiness was built with love and real connections. Beatriz entered the office bringing him a cup of coffee. "Did you need this?" she asked with a gentle smile. Eduardo looked at her, feeling a peace he didn't know he could feel. "Actually, I needed more of a conversation with you," he replied with a sincere smile. Beatriz sat in the chair next to him. "About what?" He took a deep breath, trying to organize his thoughts. "About us. About what's happening between us." He looked at her, his eyes reflecting the sincerity of his words. "Beatriz, you brought me something I didn't know was lost. You brought life back to my house, to my heart." Beatriz watched attentively without words. The intensity of Eduardo's gaze made her feel a different emotion, as if he were revealing something deep and true. I don't know what to say. You've already been so generous, Eduardo. I didn't ask you to change, but I feel that you're opening up, and that's much more than I expected. Eduardo held her hands with an unexpectedly affectionate gesture. I know it's not easy to trust someone after so long, but I want to try. I want you to know that for me this is serious. I really want you and Lia to be part of my life. Beatriz felt a tear forming in the corner of her eye, but she smiled with her emotions on the surface. You don't know how much this means to me, Eduardo. I also want to believe in this, not just for me, but for the three of us. He hugged her affectionately, as if he finally knew that what was happening there was something he didn't want to let slip away. In the following days, Beatriz and Eduardo began to plan their future together, something that seemed unthinkable for him just a few months ago. He started getting more actively involved in Lia's life, and each little gesture of affection he received from the baby softened his heart even more. Beatriz, in turn, also felt more at ease, as if she finally had the chance to build something lasting and beautiful alongside Eduardo. One afternoon, Beatriz was in the garden with Lia, playing with her, while Eduardo observed from the office window. The scene, so simple and so full of love, deeply touched his heart. He had become a different person. He knew that, with Beatriz and Lia by his side, his life had finally found the balance he had sought throughout his existence. Eduardo left the office, walked to the garden without saying a word, and knelt beside Beatriz. He extended his hands to Lia, who immediately clung to him with a wide smile. You're ready to be my partner, aren't you? Eduardo said, looking at the baby with tenderness. Beatriz smiled with shining eyes. She's already teaching you the meaning of unconditional love. I have no doubt you're going to be a great father to her, Eduardo. He looked at Beatriz with a smile full of hope and gratitude. I'm not perfect, but I'll do my best. And with you by my side, I know we can build something very special. Beatriz moved closer, hugging him while he held Lia in his arms. The sun set slowly, illuminating the trio with a soft golden light. There, in that simple yet profound moment, Eduardo knew he had finally found what he had been searching for. Not more money or power, but love, family, and true happiness.